Renee Johnson stepped through the heavy oak doors of the Hart estate, her sensible shoes clicking against the cold marble of the foyer. The mansion felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum dedicated to the man in the beige suit. Every surface was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting a world that was as beautiful as it was sterile. Renee adjusted the collar of her crisp maid's uniform, her eyes scanning the grand staircase, but she was quickly intercepted by a shadow moving from the corner of the hall. Eleanor Price, the senior house worker, approached with a gait that suggested she had spent decades trying not to be heard. Her face was a map of deep-set lines, and her eyes darted toward the upper floors with a frantic sort of caution. Before Renee could offer a standard greeting, Eleanor raised a skeletal finger to her lips, the gesture sharp and panicked. "Listen to me carefully, girl," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. "This isn't like the houses you've worked in before. In this house, silence is the only currency that matters." She led Renee toward the service quarters, her movements stiff. "Mr. Hart doesn't care for chatter. He doesn't care for excuses. You move like a ghost, you work like a machine, and you never, under any circumstances, make a sound that isn't necessary for your duties." Renee nodded, her gaze steady, but her mind was already processing the strange atmosphere. She had been hired because of her impeccable references and her reputation for quiet efficiency, but the fear radiating off Eleanor felt excessive. "I understand the rules, Mrs. Price," Renee replied softly. Eleanor stopped in her tracks, turning to grip Renee's arm with surprising strength. "You don't. You see a powerful man, a wealthy man, but you don't see the walls he's built. He lives in a world we can't enter. If you drop a glass, if you sneeze too loud, if you even breathe heavy when he's in a mood, you'll be out on the street before your coat is off the rack." The older woman looked up at the ceiling, her voice dropping even lower. "He's watching, Renee. Always watching. He can't hear your apologies, so don't bother making them. Just be invisible." Renee looked past Eleanor toward the elevator that led to the master's study. She had seen Dominic Hart in the news, the distant, cold ruler of the city, but as she prepared to begin the new order of her life, she felt a strange pull of curiosity. She didn't just see a boss, she saw a man trapped in a fortress of his own making. Renee moved through the master's study with the haunting grace Eleanor had demanded. The room was a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, smells of old paper and expensive espresso hanging in the air. Dominic Hart sat behind his desk, a titan in a perfectly tailored beige suit, his eyes fixed on a ledger as if the numbers themselves were a map of the city he owned. He was a statue of focus, a man who navigated the world by sensing the subtle vibrations of the floorboards and the shift of light when a door opened. To him, Renee was just another ghost in his machine, a rhythmic movement in his peripheral vision that required no acknowledgement. She worked systematically, dusting the edges of the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the harbor. The morning sun poured in, catching the dust motes in the air and casting a sharp, unforgiving light across the side of Dominic's head. As she moved closer to the desk to polish the window ledge, her rhythm faltered. Renee wasn't like the previous staff who kept their eyes glued to the floor in a state of perpetual flight. She was a woman who noticed the fine details, the fray in a rug, the tilt of a frame, and now, the small, dark shadow nestled deep within the boss's ear canal. She paused, her polishing cloth suspended. From this angle, with the sunlight acting like a surgical lamp, the congenital defect the world spoke of looked less like a biological failure and more like a physical intruder. It was a waxy, compacted mass, settled so deep it appeared part of his anatomy, yet to Renee's trained eyes, it looked like a barrier. She thought of the specialists who must have stood exactly where she was standing. Men with degrees and high fees who had looked at this man and seen only what they were paid to see. Dominic didn't look up, but she felt the air in the room thicken. He had sensed her pause, his jaw clenching as he waited for the ghost to resume its duties. Any other servant would have pulled back in terror, but Renee felt a surge of maternal concern that overrode the rules of silence. She stepped closer, her shadow falling across his desk. She wasn't looking at the most dangerous man in the city, she was looking at a man trapped behind a door that had no handle. Her gaze remained fixed on the anomaly, a silent realization dawning on her that the king's crown was forged from a silence that didn't have to be there. Renee's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that contrasted with the deathly stillness of the room. She knew the rules, she had memorized the warnings etched into Eleanor's trembling face. To touch the untouchable Dominic heart was more than a breach of protocol, it was a form of suicide. Yet, as she looked at the man in the beige suit, she didn't see a monster. She saw a prisoner. From the doorway, Eleanor Price froze. Her hands gripped her silver tray so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had come to check on the new girl, to ensure the silence was being maintained, but the scene before her made the air vanish from her lungs. Renee wasn't cleaning. She was moving toward the desk with a terrifying, purposeful stride. Eleanor wanted to scream, to pull the girl back into the shadows, but her voice was trapped in a throat constricted by pure, unadulterated terror. Dominic sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere. The vibrations on the floor grew heavier, closer. He didn't look up immediately, expecting the movement to veer away as it always did. When it didn't, his hand instinctively drifted toward the mahogany drawer that housed his pistol. He raised his cold, gray eyes, intending to strike fear into the intruder, but he was met with a gaze so steady and compassionate that his fingers faltered. Renee reached out. Eleanor let out a choked, silent gasp, her eyes wide as she witnessed the impossible. No one touched the boss. Even his inner circle kept a respectful, fearful distance. But Renee's hand moved with the grace of a healer, not the aggression of an assassin. She didn't flinch as she leaned over the heavy desk, her shadow engulfing his financial reports. "Mr. Hart," she whispered, knowing he couldn't hear the sound but hoping he could feel the intent. Dominic sat perfectly still, his jaw locked. He could feel the heat radiating from her palm as it neared his face. Every defensive instinct he had honed over 37 years screamed at him to retaliate, to crush the hand that dared to invade his personal sanctuary. Yet, there was a strange, magnetic sincerity in Renee's focused expression that held him captive. For the first time in his life, the man who controlled the city surrendered his control to a woman who held nothing but a cleaning cloth and a glimmer of hope. As her fingertips finally made contact with the skin near his ear, Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the explosion of violence that surely had to follow such a brazen act of defiance. The pressure in the room was suffocating, a vacuum of anticipation that seemed to pull the oxygen from Eleanor's lungs as she watched from the threshold. Dominic sat as still as a tombstone, his gray eyes locked onto Renee's with an intensity that would have withered a lesser soul. Renee did not waver. She reached into the small pocket of her apron and produced a specialized, slender grooming tool, an object that looked inconsequential but felt, in this moment, like a key to a forgotten kingdom. Her touch was light, almost spectral, as she angled Dominic's head toward the harsh, revealing sunlight of the window. Eleanor's heart hammered a frantic tattoo against her ribs, expecting the boss to snap Renee's wrist at any second. Instead, Dominic remained frozen, his breathing shallow, caught in the gravity of Renee's quiet confidence. He felt the cool metal of the tool enter the canal, followed by a sensation of deep, shifting movement that he had been told was physically impossible. Renee's brow furrowed in absolute concentration. She worked with the steady hand of someone who had spent a lifetime fixing the small, broken things that the powerful ignored. She applied a gentle, persistent leverage, navigating the narrow passage with surgical grace. Suddenly, there was a faint, wet release, a localized internal pop that only Dominic could feel in the marrow of his jaw. Renee pulled back slowly. Resting in the center of her palm was a dark, waxy, and compacted mass the size of a pebble. It was the physical manifestation of 37 years of isolation, a wall of biological debris that had been allowed to harden into a fortress. Then, the world exploded. The transition wasn't a fade-in, it was a violent, sensory assault. The sudden equalization of pressure felt like a physical blow to the side of Dominic's head, making him flinch as if he'd been struck by a heavyweight. A roar like a tidal wave rushed into his skull. It was the sound of his own ragged, terrified inhale, a sharp, textured rasp he had never known had a voice. His hands flew to his ears, his vision blurring as his brain struggled to categorize the incoming data. The grandfather clock in the corner, which had been a silent companion for decades, suddenly announced itself with a deafening, metallic thrum-tick-thrum that sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. From the doorway, the sound of Eleanor's tray clattering as her hands shook was a thunderclap. Dominic gasped, the sound of his own voice vibrating through his throat and into his newly opened ears, a raw, broken note of pure shock. The silence he had ruled for a lifetime was dead, shattered by the heavy, beautiful, and terrifying symphony of a world that had finally found its volume. Dominic remained slumped in his leather chair, his hands still pressed tightly against his ears as if trying to physically hold back the tide of a new reality. The sanctuary of his office, once a temple of absolute, controlled stillness, had been desecrated. It was no longer a room, it was a chaotic chamber of overlapping vibrations and piercing frequencies. To a man who had lived 37 years in a world of felt pulses and visual cues, the sudden clarity of sound was not a gift. It was an invasion. The grandfather clock in the corner, a piece of furniture he had previously respected for its rhythmic vibration against the floorboards, was now a monster. Each swing of the pendulum was a metallic groan, and every tick-tock felt like a hammer striking a hollow pipe, echoing relentlessly against the marble walls. Beneath that, a low-frequency hum he had never sensed before began to vibrate in the back of his skull. The sound of the mansion's plumbing, water rushing through hidden veins behind the mahogany panels like a distant, angry river. Beyond the heavy study doors, the ghosts of his household had found their voices. He heard the muffled, rhythmic thud of footsteps on the stairs, not as a vibration in his feet, but as a distinct, percussive sound. Somewhere in the distance, a vacuum whirred, a mechanical scream that made his teeth ache. He could hear the sharp, staccato clinking of silverware from the dining room 3 floors below, a sound so crystalline it felt like glass breaking inside his head. Dominic risked lowering his hands, and the sudden shift in volume made his vision swim. He heard the rustle of his own silk shirt against his skin, a soft, dry whisper that felt impossibly intimate. Then, he heard a sound that made his heart stop, the wet, hitching breath of Eleanor Price. From the doorway, the senior housekeeper was sobbing, a jagged, broken sound of relief and terror that no lip-reading could have ever conveyed. It was raw and messy and profoundly human. Dominic looked at Renee. He could hear the steady, calm rhythm of her breathing, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the house. The city outside the window, once just a silent backdrop of lights and movement, was now a roaring beast of distant sirens, screeching tires, and the low, persistent growl of industry. His fortress had been breached. The silence that had been his shield and his identity was gone, replaced by a world that refused to be quiet, demanding that he finally listen to the secrets it had been keeping for nearly 4 decades. Dominic remained anchored to his chair, his chest heaving as he stared at the small, dark mass resting in Renee's palm. The world was no longer a flat, silent projection, it had gained a terrifying, 3-dimensional depth. He looked up at Renee, his jaw working as he tried to form a response to the miracle she had just performed. "Thank you," he whispered. The sound of his own voice hit him with the force of a revelation. It was a rough, broken sound, textured with a vulnerability he hadn't known he possessed. For 37 years, he had used his voice as a tool, projecting words into a void, never receiving the vibration of his own soul in return. Now, hearing the timbre of his vocal cords, he realized that speech was more than just information, it was an emotional fingerprint. The realization of what had been stolen from him began to settle in his marrow, colder than any winter harbor breeze. He had lived nearly 4 decades as a king in a world of whispers he could never hear, missing the subtle cues of loyalty, the sharp edges of sarcasm, and the melodic lift of genuine laughter. Every negotiation he had ever conducted, every alliance he had forged, had been done with only half the tools of a human being. He looked at Renee again, and this time, he didn't just see a maid, he heard the soft, steady rhythm of her presence. Her breathing was a quiet, compassionate anchor in the storm of new noise. As he watched her, a tear tracked down her face, and he heard the faint, wet sound of it, a tiny, crystalline noise that felt more profound than any shout. The wonder was rapidly being eclipsed by a dark, calculating fury. If a simple housekeeper could restore his world in seconds, then the decades of medical failure weren't just incompetence, they were a coordinated campaign of sensory imprisonment. Someone had wanted him deaf. Someone had found it safer to rule alongside a man who couldn't hear the blade being sharpened behind his back. Dominic stood, the expensive fabric of his beige suit rustling like a warning. He had finally found his voice, and he knew exactly whose names he would call out when he came to collect the debt. Dominic stood frozen, the silence of the room replaced by the soft, rhythmic sound of Renee's breath and the distant, muffled sobbing of Eleanor in the hallway. He looked down at the small, waxy stone in Renee's palm, the physical anchor that had kept him drifting in a quiet void for 37 years. The anger was there, a cold current beneath the surface, but as he met Renee's eyes, it was momentarily eclipsed by a profound sense of debt. He moved toward her, his footsteps echoing with a crisp, authoritative click that he was finally hearing as well as feeling. Any other person in this city would have demanded a ransom for such a miracle. His advisors would have negotiated terms, and his enemies would have used the discovery as leverage. But this woman, who moved through his house like a shadow, had asked for nothing. She hadn't waited for a contract or a command. She had simply seen a man in need and reached out with a steady hand. Dominic reached out, his fingers hovering just above hers, hesitant to touch the evidence of his liberation. For 37 years, he began, his voice sounding deeper and more resonant than he had ever imagined, I paid the best specialists in the world to find a cure. I gave them fortunes to tell me why I was broken. He looked at her, his gray eyes softening for the first time in a decade. They took my money and gave me silence. You gave me the world, and you didn't even ask for a thank you. Renee didn't pull away. She stood her ground with the same quiet confidence that had allowed her to break the most sacred rule of the house. Money can buy a doctor's time, Mr. Hart, she said softly, her voice a melody of warmth that made his chest tighten. But it can't buy eyes that want to see the truth. I didn't do this for the boss. I did it for the man who looked like he was holding his breath. Dominic felt a strange, uncomfortable heat behind his eyes. In the cutthroat hierarchy of his empire, compassion was a flaw, a vulnerability to be exploited. Yet, it was this very weakness that had achieved what all his power and wealth could not. He realized then that while he had been ruling the city, he had been a servant to a lie, and the only person honest enough to free him was the one he had deemed invisible. He took a slow, deep breath, hearing the air fill his lungs with a textured clarity, and for the first time in his life, the king felt truly humble. He didn't just owe her a job, he owed her the life he was finally about to lead. The moment Renee and Eleanor left the study, the newfound symphony of the room turned discordant. Dominic did not indulge in the wonder of sound for long. The cold, calculating mind that had built an empire was already dissecting the implications of his miracle. If a maid with a grooming tool could restore his world, then the legion of specialists he had employed over 3 decades had not been incompetent, they had been conspirators. He moved to the heavy floor safe concealed behind a panel of Italian walnut. The spinning of the dial, once a felt series of clicks in his fingertips, was now a sharp, metallic sequence of notes. The heavy door groaned open with a textured scrape of steel that set his teeth on edge. He pulled out the private ledgers, not the ones for the business, but the personal accounts detailing his medical expenditures since he took the throne. For hours, Dominic sat in a world of terrifying clarity. He heard the friction of paper against paper as he flipped through years of receipts. He heard the scratch of his own pen as he circled dates and figures. The consultation fees were astronomical, but as he cross-referenced the payments with his private offshore holdings, he noticed a recurring anomaly. Every time a major ear specialist had visited the mansion to confirm his congenital nerve damage, a secondary payment had been triggered from a trust fund he had inherited from his father. On paper, these were listed as equipment maintenance, but the numbers were too consistent, the timing too perfect. He leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking, a sound like a warning. He realized that for 20 years, he had been paying a fortune to be kept in a cage of silence. The very men he had trusted to fix him were the ones reinforcing the bars. But the audit revealed something even more sinister. The trust fund wasn't managed by a bank, it was overseen by a small firm owned by his primary physician, Dr. Morrison. Dominic stared at the final tally. Millions of dollars had been funneled through the doctor's hands to ensure Dominic remained a disabled leader. A deaf boss was a boss who couldn't hear a coup being planned in the hallway. A deaf boss was a boss who relied entirely on the transcripts provided by his inner circle. The room felt smaller now, crowded with the ghosts of conversations he had never heard. His fury was no longer a hot, impulsive thing, it had settled into a cold, clinical resolve. He closed the ledger with a heavy thud that echoed through the room like a gavel. The audit of lies was complete. Now, it was time to hear the truth from the man who had sold his silence. The heavy mahogany doors to the study groaned open, a sound Dominic had never truly perceived until now. His top lieutenant, Marcus Vane, stepped into the room with his usual swagger, a folder tucked under his arm. For years, Dominic had relied on Marcus's written reports and the clear, rhythmic movements of his lips. He had always seen Marcus as a pillar of unwavering confidence, a man whose face was a mask of cold professionalism. But as Marcus began to speak, the mask didn't just slip. It disintegrated. The waterfront shipments are secured, boss, Marcus said. Dominic froze. It wasn't just the words, it was the soundtrack of the delivery. He heard a sharp, hitching intake of breath between phrases. He heard the way Marcus's voice climbed an octave, thinning out like a fraying rope. Most damning of all was the stutter, a rhythmic, nervous tripping over the letter S that Dominic had never seen reflected in the man's lip movements. Marcus was masking his mouth with his hand as he spoke, a habit Dominic now realized was designed to hide the physical evidence of a lie. We had a minor delay at Pier 14, Marcus continued, his voice trembling with a frequency that sounded like a warning siren in Dominic's new ears. Nothing to worry about. The union reps were just being difficult. Dominic sat in silence, but for the first time, his silence was an active predator. He heard the friction of Marcus's palms rubbing against his trousers, a dry, frantic sound of anxiety. He heard the man's heartbeat, or perhaps it was just the heavy, uneven thrum of his own blood, pulsing with the realization that his most trusted soldier was terrified. In the past, Dominic would have read the report and nodded, satisfied by the calm exterior. Now, the room was filled with the noise of deception. The subtle crack in Marcus's tone told the story the ledger didn't. Pier 14 hadn't been a minor delay. It had been a disaster. Dominic let the silence stretch, watching Marcus's eyes dart toward the grandfather clock. He heard the lieutenant swallow, a loud, wet click in the back of his throat that signaled a man on the verge of a breakdown. The world of sound was stripping the power from the liars and handing it back to the king. Dominic realized then that he didn't need to ask questions. He just had to listen. The soundtrack of his empire was shifting from the quiet hum of loyalty to the frantic, off-key melody of betrayal, and he was finally, perfectly in tune. The office of Dr. Julian Morrison was a curated sanctuary of glass and steel, smelling of antiseptic and expensive scotch. When Dominic entered, he didn't wait for an invitation. He moved with a predatory grace, his beige suit catching the clinical light as he sat across from the man who had been his primary caretaker for over 20 years. Morrison looked up, a practiced smile of professional concern spreading across his face. Dominic, this is an unexpected visit. I hope there hasn't been another flare-up of the inner ear inflammation we discussed? In the past, Dominic would have watched the doctor's lips, nodding along to the script. Now, he heard the sound of a man drowning on dry land. Morrison's voice was thin and brittle, vibrating with a high-pitched frequency of panic that no amount of medical training could mask. The doctor's throat clicked as he swallowed, a sound like a dry branch snapping underfoot. I've been doing some thinking, Julian, Dominic said. His own voice sounded like grinding stones to his ears, heavy and certain. About the congenital defect. The one that was supposed to be permanent. Medical science is a journey, Dominic, Morrison replied, his voice fluttering. We've explored every avenue, but the nerve damage. Stop. The word hit the room like a gunshot. Dominic leaned forward, and for the first time, he didn't just see the doctor's eyes dart, he heard the frantic, uneven rhythm of the man's respiration. He heard the way Morrison's breath hitched every time he leaned into a lie. The doctor was vocalizing his guilt, a symphony of stutters and airless pauses that screamed louder than any confession. Dominic reached into his pocket and placed the waxy mass Renee had removed onto the glass desk. The sound of it hitting the surface, a tiny, dull thud, sent a visible shiver through the doctor. "A maid did what you couldn't do in 3 decades, Dominic whispered, his tone dropping to a low, lethal register. "I can hear the sweat on your skin, Julian. I can hear your heart trying to hammer its way out of your chest. Tell me why I spent half my life in a world of silence." Morrison's composure shattered. The sound that followed was pathetic. A wet, hitching sob that grated against Dominic's new senses. They said it was for your own protection," the doctor wailed, his voice cracking into a jagged, desperate shriek. "The trust fund, they paid me to ensure you stayed focused. A deaf man is a man who stays in his lane, Dominic. I had no choice." Dominic sat back, listening to the hollow echo of the man's excuses. The miracle was complete, but as the doctor blubbered, the soundtrack of Dominic's life was being rewritten. He wasn't just hearing a confession, he was hearing the death of his mercy. The doctor's voice was the sound of a debt that could only be paid in blood. The office was thick with the scent of fear, a sharp, acidic smell that Dominic could now pair with the frantic, wet gasping of the man cowering before him. Dr. Morrison was no longer the composed man of science, he was a heap of trembling fabric and broken pride. Dominic leaned in, his new hearing so sensitive he could hear the click of the doctor's teeth and the frantic, irregular thrum of his pulse against his carotid artery. "Names, Julian," Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to rattle the glassware on the shelves. "I want the names of the architects who designed my cage." Morrison shook his head, a pathetic, jerky motion. "You don't understand, the money didn't come from the street. It didn't come from your rivals." The doctor's voice broke into a high, thin reed of sound, a frequency of pure terror. "It came from the inside, Dominic. From the very beginning." Dominic felt the air in the room turn to ice. He heard the doctor take a shuddering breath, a sound like dry leaves being crushed. "The trust fund," Morrison stammered, his words tumbling out in a desperate, rhythmic rush. "The payments were authorized by your father's estate. But the person who signed the checks after he passed, the one who insisted the treatments continue every year." Dominic's hand tightened on the edge of the desk, the leather groaning under his grip. It was a sound he had never heard but now felt in his very soul. "It was Eleanor," Morrison whispered, the name coming out as a jagged, airless sob. "Eleanor Price. She said it was your father's dying wish. He thought a deaf son would be a son who stayed home, a son who stayed safe from the life. She believed she was protecting you, Dominic. She thought if you couldn't hear the sirens or the gunfire, you would never truly belong to the streets." The revelation hit Dominic like a physical concussion. The world of sound, so recently a gift, now felt like a weapon turned against him. He thought of Eleanor's terrified face at the door, her warnings about the rules of silence. It wasn't the fear of a servant for her master, it was the fear of a jailer watching the prisoner find the key. The woman who had raised him, who had held him when his mother died, had been the one whispering into the ears of doctors to ensure he never heard a word. "She paid me to lie to you," Morrison cried, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. "She said it was for love. Just for love." Dominic stood up, the chair screeching against the floor, a piercing, agonizing sound that mirrored the tearing of his heart. The silence of his life hadn't been a medical tragedy. It had been a betrayal wrapped in the guise of devotion. He turned toward the door, his hearing now a cold, sharp instrument, already picking up the distant, rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hall, counting down the seconds until he faced the woman who had loved him into a lifetime of darkness. Dominic returned to the mansion not as a ghost, but as a storm. The heavy front door swung open with a resonant, thunderous boom that he felt in his chest and heard in his soul. The beige suit, once a symbol of his quiet, distant elegance, now felt like a predator's skin. He didn't need to look for Eleanor, he followed the sound of her. He heard the rhythmic, frantic rustle of her apron in the kitchen and the shaky, uneven clink of a porcelain teacup against a saucer. To his new ears, her fear had a distinct, sharp frequency. He entered the kitchen, and the silence that followed was different now. It was a silence he commanded, not one he suffered. Eleanor turned, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of him. She saw the ledger in his hand and the cold, surgical clarity in his gaze. "Dominic," she whispered. To his ears, her voice was a brittle, breaking thing, layered with the weight of 37 years of secrets. "You look different." "I can hear the lies, Eleanor," he said. His voice was steady, a low vibration that seemed to make the very air in the room tremble. "I can hear the tremor in your hands. I can hear the way your heart skips because you know the cage is open." Eleanor collapsed into a chair, the wooden leg scraping against the tile with a piercing shriek. "It was for you," she wailed, the sound raw and jagged. "Your father, he saw the blood on his hands every night. He didn't want that for you. He thought if the world stayed quiet, it would stay kind." Dominic looked at the woman who had been his mother in every way that mattered, hearing the tragic, twisted sincerity in her confession. But the debt of a stolen life was too high for sentiment. "You didn't make the world kind, Eleanor. You just made me vulnerable to the people who wanted me gone." He turned his gaze toward the doorway, where Renee stood. He heard her soft, steady breathing, the only honest sound in a house built on deception. He realized then that his empire would no longer be ruled through the interpretation of whispers and the reading of lips. He would rule through the truth of tone and the reality of sound. "Eleanor," Dominic said, his voice cold and final. "You will leave this house tonight. You will take the silence you loved so much and find a place where I never have to hear your name again." As she was led away, the mansion fell into a new kind of quiet, a peaceful, honest stillness. Dominic stood in the center of the foyer and closed his eyes, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sirens of the city, and the gentle rustle of Renee's uniform as she stepped toward him. He wasn't the silent king anymore. He was a man who could finally hear the world, and more importantly, a man who knew exactly who to trust. The debt was collected, the score was settled, and for the first time in his life, Dominic's heart was truly, loudly free.